Hello and welcome to some Mr. Roberts history. Today we will be going through Henry VIII. Now, whilst this is a summary, I will be trying to cover a very long period of history here because he was king from the 1509. No, that would have been embarrassing. 1509 until 1547. Now, I assume we've all heard the name Henry VIII. We know he's famous. We're going to find out exactly why. Now, there are actually quite a few significant things that happened in his reign, so let us strap in. In brief, essentially, he is the second Tudor king. His name is Henry VIII. Any guess at his dad's name? If you guessed Henry VII, you are correct. Easy way to remember it, I suppose. Now, he was in fact king from 1509 to 1547 and saw a lot of changes. Now, he's most famous for his wives, perhaps, but he should perhaps be more famous for the break with Rome and the creation of the Church of England. Now, I will let you be the judge of that by the time we get to the end of this video as to whether you think his wives should make him more famous or the break with Rome should make him more famous. And if you don't know what the break with Rome is, you will by the end of the video. So, as we go through, let's just double check, how on earth did he become king in the first place? Well, like most kings, he becomes king with the death of the old king, or the old queen, as the case may be. So in 1509, Henry VII died, and his son, Henry VIII, ascended. Now, technically speaking, he wasn't actually supposed to be king, because Henry VIII was the second child of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. As a matter of fact, he had an older brother, Arthur, who was all set to be king, but unfortunately he died of fever. And that is how Henry VIII became the heir to the throne. So, after he died, he'd already been married to Catherine of Aragon as a way of pleasing Spain, but Spain was only pleased with Catherine of Aragon being married to Arthur because he was all set to be the next king. When he wasn't king, they weren't happy with this anymore. So, to smooth things over, Henry VII arranged for Henry VIII to be married to Catherine. This is how he ended up being king, and Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, was his queen. Now, most people, when they think of Henry VIII, they probably think of this angry, fat, big man making demands of everyone and executing all his wives, which of course is only partially true and actually fairly inaccurate. When he was younger, he was actually known as a jovial, which means very, very happy, very, very upbeat, chivalrous king, very polite, followed all the rules, possessed great knowledge of the humanities. He was thought to be a good student. He was considered charming. He was considered interesting. He was fluent in Latin, French, Spanish. He was actually very, very fluent, I should say, very, very well versed in theology, which means religion. He was an expert in religion. He had studied it very much in detail as a young man. When he thought his brother Arthur was destined to be king, he actually briefly considered that he might end up joining the church, perhaps as a bishop. So there we go. He was also a very talented musician. He wrote his own music. He could play music. He wrote poetry. And believe it or not, he was known as a great dancer. Well, there you go. Of course, even young Henry loved eating and drinking, something he became much, much more famous for. But young Henry, quite charming, very loyal to his wife, very well liked, and very well versed in religion and other knowledge. Now, this is where you may decide this is everything I need to know about Henry. Because how many wives did he have? What were their names? I'll tell you, of course. So, if you're not aware of the fact, whoops, get rid of that. Just in case you're unclear, Henry VIII had 6 wives. His first has already been discussed, Catherine of Aragon. Now, his second is perhaps just as, or sometimes even more famous, Anne Boleyn. His third wife, and some say his favorite, Jane Seymour, that's because she gave him a son. And then, of course, we have Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. Now, I am certain some of you will be aware of the song that goes along with this. Divorce beheaded died, divorce beheaded survived. So that means only 2 of his 6 wives were killed. So he didn't kill all his wives. He only killed 2 of them. So that's understandable, right? Of course not. That's horrible. But a lot of people think he actually killed all of his wives, but in fact, only 2. That's still too many, I should point out. Now, in terms of remembering their names, here's what you're going to do. 50% of his wives are called Catherine. So you can remember, Catherine is, of course, the most common name. It's the #1 name. So you can remember that Catherine is his first wife. The second most common name, of course, is going to be Anne, because there's 2 of those. And because there's 2 Annes, you can remember that Anne was his second wife, which means there's only a third name to remember, and that is Jane. So you will always remember that his third wife is Jane. So 1 is the #1 name, so you know it's Catherine. 2 is the second most popular name, so you know that his second wife is named Anne. And the only third name, #3, is Jane. Now, in terms of 4, 5, 6, well, it's a simple matter of it goes Catherine, Anne, Jane, and Catherine. So it goes Catherine, Anne, Jane, and Catherine, Catherine, Anne, Jane, and Catherine if you go up and down the list. But that only adds up to 5. But just guess Catherine again, and that's his 6th wife too. So you will always be able to remember Catherine, Anne, Jane, and Catherine, Catherine. Well, hopefully. So that is his wives. Now, he also had 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. Mary from Catherine of Aragon, Elizabeth from Anne Boleyn, Edward from Jane Seymour. No other wife bore him children. Now, this is where we need to get into some key words here. We've got these 2 concepts, Catholic and Protestant. This is going to become quite a big deal with Henry VIII. So Catholics are Christians that follow the Pope in Rome, members of the Roman Catholic Church. So if you are Christian and you listen to the Pope, you are Catholic. If you are Christian and you do not listen to the Pope, do not follow the Pope, that makes you a Protestant. So you can have different types of Protestants, but only one type of Catholic. I'll give you a moment to process, and then I'll go into an example. So what did they all believe? Well, first of all, they all believe in Jesus. They all believe in the Bible. They all believe the basic tenets of Christianity. It's where you get into the details that they start to differ. So Catholics believed the Pope was the head of the church. Protestants believed the monarch is the head of the church. And then you get a different type of Protestant, extreme Protestants or Puritans, who think there should be no head of the church. Ooh. Now, there are obviously many, many, many more differences between the 3, but that is essentially where they all start from at the top. I listen to the Pope, I listen to the King, I don't think we should listen to anyone, and these are the 3 key differences. Now, obviously, there is much, much more to go through, so if you need, take a screenshot of the video now, and I would advise revising these differences for yourselves. So, this is the difference, though, because Henry was a Catholic. Now, I'm using this was as in he was a Catholic, but then he changed. Not he was a Catholic always. He was a Catholic until he changed. But in 1521, Henry was given the title Fide Defensor, Defender of the Faith in Latin, by the Pope. So what can we infer? Well, it seems to me the Pope, who's the head of the Catholic Church, he would only give out titles and medals to extremely good Catholics. In fact, defender of the faith makes it sound like Henry is protecting Catholicism. So basically in 1521, Henry is a super duper awesome Catholic. But something changes. I wonder what it could be. Now, keep in mind, he's been king for 12 years at this point because he was crowned in 1509. He's been married to Catherine of Aragon the whole time. He's been Catholic the whole time. He's super duper Catholic at this time. What is going to change? Well, after this point, Henry has a problem. You see, Henry likes being number one. And the way that the hierarchy of society goes, if you're a Catholic, you're at the bottom. More important than a regular Catholic is a priest. More important than a priest is a bishop. More important than a bishop is an archbishop. More important than an archbishop is a cardinal. And more important than everyone is the Pope. Now, Henry is there. He's a regular Catholic, technically speaking. And the Pope is obviously there at the top. Henry wants to be at the top. He doesn't think he should be having to be second to anyone. So that's one of the reasons he had a problem with the Pope. He didn't like being bossed around, but it also is far more complicated than that. Because, as I stated, in 1509, Henry becomes king. The only church in England is the Roman Catholic Church. So there's no other option. You can only be Catholic. Now, he married the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, in 1509, and he desperately wanted a male heir. But Catherine had only given birth to a daughter, and by this time is getting to be a bit too old to have more children. So Henry decided he didn't love her anymore and fell in love with someone else called Anne Boleyn. She was young. She could have more children. She may be able to give him a son. So in 1527, Henry asked the Pope to let him divorce Catherine. The Pope refused. Uh-oh, this is because technically the Pope doesn't have to listen to Henry. Henry doesn't get to tell the Pope what to do. So this is a problem. Now, Henry has another problem as well. So not just this divorce that he needs, as we see. So it's not just the divorce. That's one of his problems. And that's one of the problems he had with the Pope. He also has these other issues. And these other issues include he needs money. Now, one of the reasons he needed money was he was fighting wars against France. And he decided, hang on a second, if I didn't pay all this money to the church, who are also very, very wealthy, maybe I could keep that for myself. So that's another reason that he sort of is not getting along as well with the Pope. And the third reason is basically to do with this. Catholics have a lot of power, and Protestants don't like that. And they didn't want the Pope to have so much power in England. So we've got these three things going on, but Henry doesn't really do anything about it until 1533. Anne Boleyn is pregnant, but he's still married to Catherine. If Anne Boleyn has a child when she is not married to Henry, that child cannot be the next heir. So if she was to have a boy, the thing Henry wants most in the world, that boy could never become king. So that is a problem. So he has these decisions to make. He decides to leave the Catholic Church and create the Church of England. So let's quickly go through these answers here. Very, very quickly. Why did he want to become head of the church? Basically, he didn't like being second to the Pope. He wanted to be the most powerful person in England. He also wanted to get himself a divorce, grant himself a divorce. The Pope had refused, but Henry was able to get his divorce and become head of the Church of England in 1534. So basically, by making himself head of the church, he could get his goal of a divorce, so he could marry Anne Boleyn and get himself an heir. Now, there's a man named Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell made a lot of decisions for Henry VIII. Why on earth was that the case? Well, Thomas Cromwell was very, very loyal. And he also promised to make Henry VIII the richest king in Europe. He also created the law that made it treason not to accept Henry VIII as head of the church. So he made it much, much easier for Henry to legitimize himself as the new Pope of England, as it were. Why could the monasteries solve Henry's problems? Monasteries could solve Henry's problems due to their immense wealth. Although he no longer paid taxes to the Pope because he'd broken with Rome, Henry still had spent too much money. Monasteries had an annual income of £200,000 a year. Now keep in mind, this is the 1530s. That is double the income of the king himself. Cromwell was a key figure in the closure of these monasteries, which became known as the dissolution of the monasteries. And we're going to come back to that phrase in a moment. So this meant that Cromwell had promised to make him rich. And by closing the monasteries, guess what? He did become very, very wealthy. But it also made Cromwell not particularly popular. So you can imagine if they were sitting around, a peasant and a lord, and having a chat, it might look something like this. Oi, mate, how am I supposed to afford these new taxes? Don't look at me. I take my orders from the king. Blame him. Yeah, right. So I can lose my head for treason. No, I think I'll blame Cromwell instead. I never liked him. Hey, I don't like him either. He was a lousy blacksmith, useless peasant, just like you. And now he gives me orders. Terrible. Okay, well, we hate him for different reasons, but we both hate him. So that's something. Did we just become best friends? Yeah, sure. Any chance I can pay less taxes, buddy? No. Now pay up. Now, this may seem a little bit silly in terms of this conversation, but in actual fact, there is a lot going on here. Because why would you blame Cromwell for all these taxes? They come from the king? Well, because you don't want to lose your head for treason. That treason law made people less likely to blame Henry. That's putting your life at risk. And more likely to blame Cromwell. And what the landlord is saying here, Cromwell used to just be a peasant. Now, all of a sudden, he's one of the most powerful people in England. The lords don't like that. They don't like listening to a peasant who's giving them orders. And of course, that means that Cromwell is unpopular with the peasants, unpopular with the lords. But no matter what, you still always have to pay your taxes. Okay. So with all of that said, let's quickly try and get through what Henry's religious changes were. Basically, he wanted to create Catholicism without the Pope. So even though he stopped payments to the church in Rome, and there is this thing called the Act of Supremacy, Henry VIII is in fact the new Pope of England, the head of the Church of England, and then they closed the monasteries. Now, at first, they only closed the smaller monasteries and took some of the money that the church had. But eventually, they decided they needed way more money, and they just took all of them. And then we get the publication of an English Bible. Now, in 1536, William Tyndale was actually executed for creating an English Bible in the 1520s. But by 1539, they decided, you know what, maybe we should have the Bible in English. Because as we all know, what language was the Bible in every country? It didn't matter what language they spoke. The Bible was, of course, in Latin. If you said Latin, well done. If you did not, I hope you just learned something. Okay? And then we end up with this. The Act of 6 Articles supported Catholic beliefs and services, said Protestants were to be persecuted? What? Well, this is kind of weird. Because basically, Henry didn't want all these new Protestant beliefs and all these ideas saying no one should be head of the church and we should change this. He was just like, no. Exactly what Catholicism was, but I keep all the money instead of the Pope. That's it. That's the only change he wanted. So whilst technically he is a Protestant because he no longer follows the Pope, he basically wanted to keep everything the same. Hence this Catholicism without the Pope title. Now, I would recommend you screenshot this part of the video and use these particular dates and events for revision. I hope that is done now. So, as we move forward, let's see how the people sort of felt about all these changes. Now, whether you know this or not, people take religion quite seriously, and so much so that when you change it, people often get a little bit angry. So this is what ends up happening. We end up with the Act of Succession and the Treason Act, brought in by Cromwell, of course, to clear up all of these issues and to make sure that no one could question Henry, otherwise they get killed. And to make sure, that means if no one's questioning him, he must be the one in charge. Yeah, seems pretty okay, very reasonable. Okay, he's in charge, but if I say he's not, I die. I'll just say that he's in charge. So for most people, things basically carry on as usual. Services are still held in Latin, basic beliefs remain the same, penalties of Protestantism were still execution, and only those who could afford a copy of the New English Bible could read it. So basically, okay, no Pope, just Henry, everything seems fine, except not. Because of the dissolution of the monasteries, people relied on the monasteries. They were people's source of relief, source of help. Basically, they were like a social services department. If you could not eat, you went to the monastery. The monastery would, then the monks there would feed you. They'd give you soup, they'd give you gruel, whatever the case may be. And it also meant that by the closing of the monasteries, there was less monks around out in public helping the poor, helping the needy. So it wasn't just you could go to them. The monks would come out of these monasteries into the villages and help people. So a lot of people were upset with the closing of the monasteries. And we end up with this rebellion. But this rebellion has a bit of an odd name. It is called the Pilgrimage of Grace. Now, the Pilgrimage of Grace sounds like a very peaceful time, but in actual fact, it is not. It was the most serious rebellion during Henry VIII's reign. Starts in Lincolnshire, spreads to Yorkshire. Good old Yorkshire, okay? And they are basically a little bit further away from London, so they're a little bit distant, and Henry doesn't have as much control there. So they organized. We end up with these large mobs saying, you cannot close our monasteries. We want them open. We want them open. And so this is what they demanded. We demand that two of his most trusted advisors, a guy named Thomas Cranmer, who was the archbishop, basically his religious enforcer, and the gentleman we've discussed, Thomas Cromwell, his legal enforcer, the guy who's writing all these new laws. They want them both gone. They want the monasteries back, and we want Princess Mary restored as the king's heir, because Mary is a Catholic. So they want a Catholic to be the king's heir, not anyone else, as the case may be. So the Duke of Norfolk, who was loyal to Henry, he meets with them. And he says, yeah, no worries, absolutely. So he promises all of these things just to keep them calm. But the king has no intention to keep these promises. So all the rebels went home. So instead of being in one large group, they all went back to their various smaller groups. And the king's men rode around the country, rounded them up, and killed them. 200 were hanged. And Robert Aske, the leader of the Pilgrimage of Grace, is officially executed for treason. So the king had doubled his income. He sold any of the land of the monasteries that he didn't need anymore. And because of this, he became even wealthier. And many servants, particularly in the north, end up jobless. So all of a sudden, we end up with this very prosperous south of England, while the north of England is sort of struggling behind a little bit. But it's okay. They absolutely solved that problem, and there is no wealth disparity between the south of England and the north of England anymore, obviously. I mean, this was 500 years ago. Imagine if there was still some sort of argument between the north of England and the south of England as to the wealth disparity. So, the quick timeline of this one. This begins in 1536 with the closing of the smaller monasteries. It begins in October, but it really comes to a head in mid-October, and the rebels actually are rising up. They are pushing back against the king's men. But by the time of July 1537, all of this is dealt with. And as a result of being able to deal with this and remove any rebels rising up or anyone questioning his authority, This is one of the things that encouraged Henry VIII to even close the big monasteries as well. So that is the pilgrimage of grace. In terms of the legacy of Henry VIII, keep in mind, so much has happened. He wasn't meant to be king. His brother was. He ends up being king. He defends England from those pesky Protestants all the way up until 1527. So much so that he got a medal in 1521 from the Pope. He asks for a divorce. He doesn't get it. He grants himself a divorce and breaks with Rome. He has a daughter with Anne Boleyn named Elizabeth. He ends up closing the monasteries because he wants even more money. There's a rebellion against him, the pilgrimage of grace. And then he tells them, absolutely, no matter what you say, I will absolutely fulfill your promises. They go home. He kills them all, and no one questions his authority again on a large scale. So he ends up ruling until his death in 1547, and he dies at the age of 55. His son, Edward, succeeded him as king, and Henry is buried next to, as I say, his favorite or true wife, Jane Seymour, who gave him a son and therefore was his favorite. Now, you may remember him for his break with Rome. You may remember him for the pilgrimage of grace. You most likely will remember him for all of his wives. That's most people in the world remember him for that. But he also has another nickname, which is the father of the British Navy, because after strengthening England's naval forces, this is when England starts to become actually quite powerful on the seas. Up until this point, the seas were actually controlled by Spain and Portugal. So much so that the Pope had basically split the world in half and said half belongs to Spain and half belongs to Portugal, because they're the only ones who can sail. Now, under Henry VIII, England starts to expand its navy, and it is, in fact, under Elizabeth, his daughter, one of England's most infamous monarchs, that England starts to rule the waves. And we see the start and the beginnings of a true British Empire. So Henry VIII has quite a legacy. He's had so much happen while he was king, and his children shaped Britain for literally a century. So, with all of that said, I hope we have a bit of a more detailed and nuanced understanding of Henry VIII, and I hope you don't just remember him for his wives, but that is a pretty memorable fact as well. So, with all of that said, thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.